It started with the sound of shouting in a sterile hospital hallway sharp. Entitled and echoing through the quiet like a fire alarm, "I know my rights. You can't keep me here." Those were the first words I ever heard from Karen, though. Back then, I had no idea who she really was. I was still in my lab coat, tired from back-to-back trauma shifts, not even off the clock when the emergency room buzzed with security being called to calm a woman who was harassing nurses at the front desk. I stepped out to see what the commotion was, and there she was, blonde, bobbed hair stiff with hairspray, oversized sunglasses perched on her forehead, holding her phone up like a weapon and barking threats about lawsuits, news coverage, and knowing people at the board. Most people assumed she was a distraught relative or an angry patient. But I knew the moment she turned and locked eyes on me with that pointed, assessing glare, she wasn't here because of medical need. She was here to cause trouble. What no one else knew in that moment was that Karen wasn't just any difficult visitor. She was the president of the HOA in the neighborhood I had just moved into 2 weeks earlier, a neighborhood I chose for. Its supposed peace, quiet, and sense of community. But instead of welcome notes or housewarming visits, I had already found 2 anonymous complaints shoved under my door about loud garbage bins, non-compliant mailbox paint, and the classic favorite guests parked more than 6 inches from the curb. I hadn't made the connection between those notes and the woman now making a scene in the ER until she turned her fury toward me and said, You're the one who thinks he's above the rules just because he wears a white coat." That's when it clicked. Karen from Unit 1 to B, who lived 3 doors down from me and had already filed 2 complaints with the HOA about my improper trash can placement and refusal to attend mandatory community orientation. That's who was standing in the hospital, trying to get my nursing team written up for making her wait at triage for 15 minutes. Before I could respond, she launched into a tirade about how she had chest pain but was being ignored, how the hospital was a disgrace, and how people like him, nodding directly at me, only care about status, not service. I tried to calm the situation, remind her we follow medical protocol and triage based on urgency, but she wouldn't hear it. She wanted a private room, immediate tests, and her HIPAA rights respected, though she clearly had no understanding of what HIPAA even meant. That moment was the start of something much bigger than a hospital meltdown. It was the spark that lit a months-long firestorm of petty vendettas, personal attacks, and abuse of power that would threaten not just my peace and reputation, but also the safety of my patients, my coworkers, and eventually my job. If you've ever wondered just how far a spiteful HOA president would go to punish someone for not bending to her control, you're about to find out. This is the story of how a doctor found himself at war with the very woman who was supposed to be his neighbor. Stick around because it gets a lot worse before it gets better. And what happens next will make you question everything you thought you knew about neighborhood politics. Subscribe to Sham Stories for more true and dramatic tales of power, revenge, and the fight for justice in the places you'd least expect. After the confrontation in the ER, I figured Karen's hospital meltdown would remain an isolated incident maybe. The stress of being a self-important HOA president had pushed her into temporary hysteria, but I severely underestimated the depth of her bitterness and how personal she would make it. The next morning, I found a citation from the HOA taped to my front door, boldly accusing me of hostile conduct in a public setting while representing the neighborhood. The wording was vague and absurd, especially considering the hospital was an HOA property, and I wasn't representing anyone but myself in my own professional role. But it was clear this wasn't about rules anymore. It was about revenge. I tried to laugh it off until my neighbor Jessica, who lived across the cul-de-sac, stopped me that afternoon and hesitantly asked if I'd really screamed at an elderly woman and refused her treatment. That's when I realized Karen had gone straight to the HOA newsletter, the private Facebook group, and God knows where else. Twisting the story to fit her agenda, she'd painted herself as a vulnerable community member, mistreated by a cold, arrogant doctor who thought he was above the rest of us just because he had a degree. I hadn't even had a chance to unpack my last moving box. And already I was being slandered by a woman who ran her HOA like a monarchy and saw my mere existence as a challenge to her rule. Still, I tried to stay calm, choosing professionalism over confrontation. I continued working long shifts, quietly complied with the less ridiculous HOA requests, and did my best to avoid Karen's sharp gaze when I saw her patrolling the sidewalks, like some suburban watchdog in pastel linen. That effort failed completely 1 week later, when I received an internal inquiry at the hospital. Someone had filed a formal complaint against me for verbal abuse, racial insensitivity, and gender bias. It had been submitted through an anonymous online portal, but the details matched the ER incident exactly, except twisted and exaggerated beyond recognition. Claimed I refused care to an elderly woman based on her gender and appearance, that I used discriminatory tone, and that I made inappropriate comments about the elderly being a burden. I was stunned. None of it was true, and fortunately the hospital's security cameras and triage logs fully backed me up. My colleagues even vouched for me, stating clearly that Karen had been disruptive, aggressive, and refused standard triage protocol. The complaint was dismissed, but it triggered a mandatory HR evaluation and a temporary note on my personnel file, which could have impacted my promotion timeline or credential reviews. It didn't matter that the claim was false. It had done damage, and that was Karen's goal. She wasn't trying to win a case. She was trying to chip away at my credibility until something broke. She escalated next by turning the HOA against me even harder. Suddenly I was receiving citations almost daily. Lawn height exceeds code by 0.75 inches. Porch light wattage inconsistent with guidelines. Non-compliant door color. The kicker was a $250 fine for unauthorized medical storage, because I had a locked medicine drop box installed near my porch to collect unused prescriptions for proper disposal. Part of a community health initiative I ran through the hospital. Karen labeled it a hazardous container and cited HOA policy, even though the bylaws made zero mention of such items. I appealed, of course, but the appeals board was made up entirely of Karen's friends, 3 retirees, who barely left their houses but took her word as gospel. It became clear that I wasn't going to find justice through the HOA's internal structure. So I started documenting everything, recording every citation, saving every email, collecting witness accounts from neighbors who had seen Karen snooping around my backyard or standing just a little too close to my windows when walking by. What disturbed me most was how methodical it all was. Karen didn't rage randomly. She was calculating, deliberate, and knew exactly how to weaponize bureaucracy against people she didn't like. When I looked deeper into her past HOA leadership, I found a pattern. The Johnson family, 2 streets over, had moved after a 3-month-long battle over their patio furniture color. The Bakers had been fined repeatedly until they sold their home for a loss. And the Valencia as well, their teenage son, had been accused of vandalism after he accidentally kicked a soccer ball into Karen's hedges. She'd called the cops on him. Once I realized this wasn't personal just to me, I started talking to the neighbors she'd targeted. Many were still scared to speak up, worried Karen would retaliate, but little by little, stories trickled out. She'd filed over 300 citations in 2 years, many of them for minor or made-up infractions. She kept a detailed spreadsheet of repeat offenders and had blacklisted certain residents from attending HOA meetings, citing disruption risk. My stomach turned as I read through copied emails from her to the HOA mailing list. Warning: about a new neighbor with a God complex and people who think their career makes them exempt from community standards. The more I learned, the more I realized I couldn't just endure her nonsense and hope she'd move on. She thrived on silence and submission, and if no one stood up to her, she would keep doing this to every new neighbor who crossed her. The turning point came on a rainy Friday night when I returned from a double shift to find my garage door spray-painted in thick red letters. "Quack Doctor, get out!" My heart dropped. Max, my rescue lab, barked furiously from inside, and my neighbor Jessica rushed over with her phone already recording. I filed a police report, but the responding officer said without footage or witnesses, it would be hard to pursue. That was the night I snapped, not with rage, but with resolve. I went inside, sat at my desk, and began compiling every piece of evidence I had collected. Every citation, every neighbor's complaint, every doctored HOA policy. I took a week off work, spoke to a local attorney who specialized in HOA abuse, and learned that Karen had violated multiple homeowner rights, tampering with documents, selectively enforcing rules, and defaming residents through her HOA communications. I worked with neighbors to call an emergency HOA meeting, demanding an open forum to review board conduct. Karen tried to cancel it, citing unforeseen legal complications, but this time we had enough support to override her. Flyers went up, emails circulated, and by the time the night of the meeting arrived, nearly half the neighborhood showed up. The room buzzed with tension as I stood at the front with a projector and folders of evidence. I didn't yell, didn't. Accused just presented facts. Her abuse of power, her lies, her personal vendettas. The residents stood to share their stories. One woman cried, recounting how Karen fined her for having wind chimes. A man said he stopped hosting Sunday dinners for his grandkids because of repeated noise complaints from Karen. By the time it was over, even her closest allies looked uneasy. Karen didn't say a word. She just sat there, clutching her clipboard, eyes narrowed like a cornered animal. But for once, her silence wasn't power, it was fear. The vote to remove Karen from her position as HOA president was scheduled for the following Saturday. And though the bylaws required only a simple majority, I knew getting people to actually show up, speak up, and risk retaliation was going to be the real battle. Karen may have looked rattled after the community meeting, but she wasn't retreating. In fact, she doubled down in the most disturbing ways. 2 days after that gathering, my hospital supervisor received an anonymous letter accusing me of prescribing unnecessary medication to patients in exchange for personal favors. Of course, it was absurd. My prescription history was pristine, every record traceable and compliant with protocol. But it triggered another internal review, another round of HR interviews, another delay in my pending promotion. That same week, a code enforcement officer arrived at my home claiming there had been a report of medical waste being improperly stored on my property. He was polite, even apologetic, and quickly realized it was a baseless complaint. Showed him the medicine drop box, explained the program, and he shook his head, telling me quietly, "This isn't the first time someone from this neighborhood has called us with nonsense." That stuck with me. It wasn't just Karen's cruelty. It was how familiar the system was with it. She knew how to bend rules, how to harass without crossing legal lines. It's how to weaponize suspicion and bureaucracy like tools in her purse. But something had changed after that public forum. The neighborhood was no longer whispering. Now people were watching her too. Jessica started forwarding me screenshots from the private HOA Facebook group, where members began sharing their own citations and asking questions. Why does Karen seem to be the only one issuing fines? Why do her friends never get warnings? Why are the same families always targeted? The post that blew the lid off came from Martha, an 82-year-old widow who had lived in the neighborhood since it was first built. She posted a photo of a violation. Notice Karen had taped to her door $100 fine for leaving curtains open after 9 p.m. The comments exploded. Residents who had remained neutral now had proof this wasn't about rules. It was about control. Fear and pettiness taken to dangerous extremes. The momentum was real now, and Karen knew it. On the eve of the vote, just after sunset, I returned home from a long day of hospital rounds to find my front lawn vandalized. My garden beds were ripped up, my porch plants smashed, and a dead rat placed on my welcome mat. It was staged. Again, and this time they took the reports seriously. One of the responding officers, who had been on the previous vandalism call, told me privately that several complaints had been filed against Karen's property over the years, but none ever stuck. "She's smart," he said, "to make things look like bad luck or neighbor disputes. But if she escalates again, we'll get her." It wasn't enough to comfort me, but it was enough to keep me from backing down. The vote went ahead as planned. The community center was full dozens of residents, many holding manila folders, photos, and printouts. Karen sat near the front, lips tight, clipboard resting in her lap like a sword she wasn't allowed to draw yet. I presented a concise summary of her documented abuses: misuse of power, targeting residents with false citations, defamation, and inciting division in a peaceful community. Then one by one, neighbors stood up, some who had never spoken publicly before, and added their own voices. An elderly man recounted being fined for a decorative mailbox flag. A single mother spoke about her autistic son being reported as disturbing the peace because he hummed loudly on the front porch. A teacher described how Karen accused her of running an unlicensed tutoring business just for helping kids with homework. The final vote was 86% in favor of immediate removal. Karen stood, shaking, declared the process invalid, and stormed out of the room with her few remaining supporters trailing behind. The board confirmed her removal that night. For the first time in months, it felt like the storm had passed. But victory wasn't quiet. The next week, Karen's house became a fortress, blinds always closed, motion lights flicking on and off at the smallest movement, and her car rarely seen. But just because she lost her title didn't mean she gave up the fight. Her retaliation grew more desperate and bizarre. One morning, the hospital security team escorted me to my car after someone called in a bomb threat to the hospital. Using a spoofed number traced to a burner phone, no one was hurt. The threat was fake, but the timing couldn't be ignored. Later that week, someone slashed the tires on my car while it was parked in the hospital lot. Police took fingerprints and checked surveillance footage. And while they couldn't prove it was Karen, they noted a familiar pattern indirect. Anonymous attacks, perfectly timed with her latest loss of control. Meanwhile, the new HOA board, under Leo's leadership, began reviewing every citation Karen had issued over her years in charge. They found dozens of fabricated violations, missing funds, and payments made to a fake vendor account that traced back to an LLC under Karen's maiden name. The HOA filed civil charges against her, but the real shock came when the hospital's legal department informed me that Karen had submitted an anonymous tip to the state medical board, accusing me of falsifying patient records and issuing prescriptions under fake names. It's triggered an automatic investigation despite being clearly fake. I was cleared after weeks of review, but the stress it caused was incalculable. I barely slept. Every time my phone rang, I expected another attack. My colleagues were supportive, but I could see the weariness on their faces. They were exhausted too, by association, by worry. Karen was out of power, yet her reach still lingered like a poison in the walls. One night, I walked outside to find Max, standing alert, growling low at something in the bushes. I turned the flashlight on and saw nothing. But a minute later, I heard footsteps crunching down the side alley between my house and Karen's. When I followed them, all I found was a torn HOA citation form soaked from the sprinklers and a half-burned matchbook. That was the moment I realized she wasn't going to stop until someone forced her to. And so, I made a decision. I took every incident, every report, every act of retaliation, and handed it to my attorney. We filed a formal lawsuit, not just for harassment, but for defamation, stalking, and emotional distress. The evidence was overwhelming. Security footage, signed testimonies, financial records, or fake reports to the HOA and the state board. The judge approved the case to proceed, and Karen was served. She didn't answer the door herself. Process. Server handed it to one of her friends during a rare moment when they were watering her lawn. And that was when the silence finally began. Real silence. No more complaints. No more citations. No more whispering behind closed doors. Just quiet. But it wasn't peace, not yet. Because as we prepared for the courtroom, Karen did something no one saw coming. She turned the narrative on its head and tried to sue me back. Karen's countersuit landed on my lawyer's desk 3 weeks after we filed our harassment case, and its contents were as outrageous as they were theatrical. She accused me of orchestrating a coordinated defamation campaign using my profession as a doctor to intimidate a vulnerable senior citizen, and claimed that the community had been coerced by fear of medical retaliation to vote her out of the HOA presidency. According to her, she was the real victim targeted by a powerful man who, in her words, weaponized the neighborhood and the hospital to destroy a law-abiding woman's life. It was laughable on its face, a delusional attempt to flip the truth, but my lawyer warned me not to underestimate how much chaos a countersuit could cause. It slowed down our original case, forced additional discovery, and kept both of us locked in a legal tug-of-war that dragged our already strained nerves. Even further, my days at the hospital became increasingly difficult. It's not because of patient care I loved that part of the job, but because I constantly worried about what Karen might do next. I never parked in the same spot twice. I checked my tires every morning. I avoided the stairwells alone. Had a small camera installed on my dashboard, a second one on my front porch, and a third facing the back gate. It felt excessive, even paranoid, but every time I thought about scaling back, something new would happen. One night, I received an envelope at the hospital no return address. Just a single printed photo of me talking to a female nurse in the break room. On the back, someone had scrawled in red ink, "Does your girlfriend know?" I wasn't even dating anyone at the time, but that didn't matter. Karen wanted me on edge. Always doubting, always looking over my shoulder. I shared the photo with my attorney and the hospital's security team. They opened an internal investigation into how someone had managed to photograph staff in a restricted area. Suspicion immediately turned to a former volunteer, older woman, who had recently been let go for breaching privacy protocols. The HR department confirmed she'd been close to Karen, seen often talking to her outside during breaks, and now she was banned from all hospital properties. It was one more piece in the growing pile of evidence, and the judge allowed it to be included in our civil case. Meanwhile, back in the neighborhood, the new HOA board worked tirelessly to clean up Karen's mess. They overturned dozens of illegitimate fines, refunded nearly $12,000 in bogus penalties, and began rewriting the bylaws to prevent any single person from ever having unchecked power again. The new rules included term limits, mandatory financial transparency, and the creation of an independent review board for citations. But even as the board rebuilt trust, the psychological damage Karen left behind lingered. Some neighbors still whispered when they talked about her, afraid she was listening through their fences. Others refused to join the HOA meetings at all, still burnt out from the trauma. Then came the day of the pre-trial hearing, when both our legal teams were scheduled to present evidence before the court to determine if the full civil trial would proceed. I showed up early wearing a simple dark suit, my lawyer beside me, calm but focused. Karen arrived late, dressed in a loud purple pantsuit. The stack of printed pages she claimed were evidence of emotional distress. She handed them to the court clerk with theatrical flair, and even the judge raised an eyebrow when he saw that most of the pages were screenshots from Facebook posts she claimed slandered her character, though none even mentioned her by name. My attorney calmly presented our case clear, precise, and deeply supported by timelines, documents, witness statements, and recorded evidence. We showed how Karen had fabricated violations, manipulated HOA records, filed false reports, and waged a months-long campaign of personal retaliation. The judge asked sharp questions, especially about the spray paint, the vandalism, and the fake medical board complaints. Karen tried to dodge, claiming she'd never encouraged any illegal acts, but when pressed, she suddenly clammed up and asked to consult her lawyer. Her attorney looked visibly uncomfortable. By the end of that hearing, it was clear we had momentum on our side. The judge ruled that our case could proceed in full and throughout. Karen's countersuit on grounds of insufficient evidence and speculative intent. She looked stunned, her jaw locked tight as she stared at the bench. It was the first real loss she couldn't blame on neighborhood politics or hearsay. This was a courtroom now, and here, truth mattered. Over the next few weeks, my life slowly returned to something resembling normal. The hospital cleared me for promotion again. Max began relaxing during our evening walks, no longer barking at every shadow, and neighbors began smiling again, real smiles, not the wary, forced kind they used during Karen's reign. Jessica even organized a community barbecue, the first one in over 2 years. It was held at the cul-de-sac park, and over 50 families showed up. As I stood flipping burgers with Leo, I realized how much had been stolen from this neighborhood friendship. Trust, safety, and how long it would take to rebuild it all. But we were rebuilding piece by piece. Karen, meanwhile, had gone eerily quiet. No sightings, No online posts, no sudden HOA notices appearing in mailboxes. Her house was still occupied, lights occasionally on at night, but she never showed. Her face? Some neighbors joked that she'd gone underground, hiding until the trial was over. Others weren't so sure. Then, just 1 week before our court date, I received another envelope. This one slipped under my door at home. Inside was a single printed page, a typed message that read, "You think this ends in court? I don't lose, I wait. No signature, no return address, just that message." My hands trembled as I held it, not from fear this time, but from a mix of disbelief and anger. It was her handwriting style. My lawyer submitted it as new evidence, and the judge agreed it constituted a direct threat. It didn't delay the trial, but it painted a clearer picture of Karen's mental state. She wasn't just a bully anymore, she was unraveling. Finally, the day of the trial arrived. The courthouse was packed, not just with legal teams, but with members of the neighborhood, reporters from local outlets, and a few curious observers who had heard rumors of the HOA Karen saga. The trial would determine not only damages, but also whether Karen would be formally held accountable for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. As we entered the courtroom, I felt strangely calm. Not relieved, not triumphant, just ready. Karen sat across the aisle, her expression cold and unreadable, her lawyer avoiding eye contact with everyone. When the proceedings began, my attorney walked the court through every act of escalation, starting from that first hospital confrontation, through the fake complaints, the vandalism, the threats, and the surveillance photos. We played the security footage, showed printed statements from over a dozen neighbors, revealed the financial trail of fake HOA fees. Karen's lawyer tried to cast doubt, arguing that none of it directly ties her to the physical acts, but even the judge interrupted him, asking, "Then how do you explain the pattern of behavior that just happens to always benefit your client?" The courtroom fell silent. Karen didn't testify. Her lawyer advised her not to, citing mental and emotional exhaustion, but I could see it, she wasn't exhausted. She was calculating, watching, waiting, and for the first time, she was on the defensive. As the evidence mounted and witnesses spoke, her grip on the narrative slipped completely out of her hands. The closing arguments were delivered in a courtroom so quiet you could hear the hum of the overhead lights. Karen's attorney spoke first, grasping at what little remained of their case, painting her as a misunderstood community volunteer who was simply overzealous in her duties and had been unfairly vilified by a campaign of neighbors, eager to remove her for enforcing long-neglected rules. But the argument rang hollow, especially after a week's worth of testimony. Damning documents and clear timelines showing a methodical, sustained pattern of abuse. When it was our turn, my lawyer calmly walked the jury through every incident. Again, not with drama or flair, but with precision. He highlighted the escalation from verbal confrontation to slander, to professional sabotage, to vandalism, to threats. He reminded the court that this wasn't about one bad neighbor. It was about what happens when one person gains unchecked power and uses it to intimidate, harass, and destroy others. Then the jury deliberated. 2 hours later, they returned. With a verdict, Karen was found liable on all counts: defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, abuse of process, and harassment. The damages awarded were substantial, enough to force her into financial hardship and enough to cover legal fees and mental health costs related to the attacks. As the judge read the verdict aloud, I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel victorious. I felt release. Like I had finally exhaled after holding my breath for a year. Karen didn't look at anyone as the judgment was finalized. She just stood, gathered her paperwork, and walked out of the courtroom like a shadow disappearing from a room. The aftermath of the case rippled throughout the community. News stations picked it up. HOA Karen harasses doctor and loses big in court became a trending headline. Other communities reached out to our HOA board, asking how to implement safeguards and how to recognize the signs of authoritarian HOA abuse early. The nonprofit group for HOA victims even asked me to speak on a panel later that year. Back home, the neighborhood bloomed. The toxic fear that had lingered like mold in the corners of our block finally cleared. Kids rode bikes freely again. Porch lights stayed on past 9 p.m. without fear of fines. People started attending meetings not because they were afraid of being penalized, but because they wanted to be involved. That was the legacy we chose to create, not the fear Karen left behind, but the community we rebuilt in her absence. As for me, life slowly stitched itself back together. My promotion at the hospital was reinstated. I was offered a department leadership role, which I accepted. Max, always at my side through the worst of it, now snoozed comfortably in my office. During late shifts, a small hospital ID tag clipped to his collar. Jessica, my neighbor-turned-friend, helped organize a neighborhood mural project with the kids, painting over the ugly memories on the walls with bright, bold colors that symbolized resilience, healing, and unity. Karen sold her house 3 months. After the trial, quietly without a goodbye, the listing didn't mention her name, and the buyers were a young couple who had no idea about the war that had been waged on that street. I met them with a warm welcome basket, the kind I never received. When I moved in, and I helped them unload boxes without a clipboard in sight, that was how the healing truly began, not with lawsuits or fines, but with kindness returning to a place where it had been silenced. Still, sometimes I catch myself looking over my shoulder. Trauma doesn't leave just because the cause of it moves away. Or moments. Walking Max at dusk, when I think I see her figure in the shadows, a twitch of memory, a phantom of the past. But then I hear laughter, real laughter, from porches and open garages, and I remember that she lost. Because we stood up? Because we told the truth? Because we refused to be quiet? Karen thought she was too smart, too connected, too feared to fall. But the power of one voice multiplied by a neighborhood brave enough to echo it is stronger than any rulebook she could ever twist. So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt bullied, silenced, or threatened by someone in power, whether in your neighborhood, your workplace, or anywhere you call home, remember this story? Remember what happened when one doctor, one dog, and one fed-up block stood their ground. And remember, people like Karen don't just exist in HOA meetings. They show up in many forms. What matters is what you do when they knock on your door. If you believe in standing up for your rights, protecting your peace, and taking down the bullies no one else wants to face, then don't stay silent. Subscribe to Sham Stories right now, and be ready for the next battle that might be coming to your street.